How much further is it, Corporal?
Keep moving, lads. We stop when we're told.
January 17th, 1941. The North African sun barely rises above the desert horizon, casting long shadows across the endless dunes. Dust swirls around the narrow supply convoy, tires crunching over sand and gravel as trucks haul precious cargo toward Tobruk. Soldiers wipe sweat from their brows, eyes scanning the barren landscape for signs of the enemy. Every drop of water in those tanks is worth more than gold. Rationed, guarded, life-sustaining. On the distant ridge, German and Italian observers mark every movement, their binoculars catching glints of steel and sunlit sand. Meanwhile, Allied engineers struggle to keep the engines running, siphoning every possible drop from limited reserves. A single miscalculation, one empty water tank, could cripple the front line, force a retreat, or leave men stranded under the unforgiving desert sun. Across the Mediterranean, convoys push through icy seas, avoiding U-boats and mines, carrying not just weapons, but the lifeblood of the Allied war effort: water, fuel, and supplies. Victory in this barren theater does not come from bullets alone. It comes from careful planning, human endurance, and a resource so ordinary, yet so extraordinary, it would quietly determine the fate of nations. The desert waits. The secret is about to unfold. By the end of 1940, the world was firmly engulfed in war. Europe lay divided. Nazi Germany had overrun Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Britain stood isolated, its island defiance sustained by the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, and the fragile lifeline of transatlantic convoys. The Mediterranean, once a corridor of trade and empire, had become a theater of survival. Across North Africa, vast deserts stretched from Egypt to Libya, broken only by oases and fortified ports. The British Eighth Army, under General Archibald Wavell, faced Italian forces entrenched along the Libyan border. Initial encounters in late 1940, including Operation Compass, had achieved localized successes, yet the arrival of German Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel shifted the balance. Rommel's reputation for speed and ingenuity meant that the desert was no longer just a backdrop. It was a battlefield defined by logistics as much as firepower. Water, scarce and essential, emerged as a strategic asset. In this arid theater, every drop determined the survival of men, animals, and machinery. Vehicles depended on it to prevent overheating. Troops relied on it for hydration during marches that stretched dozens of kilometers across sun-baked terrain. Supplies shipped from Alexandria or through Tobruk's port were measured meticulously. A single convoy could make the difference between holding a line and surrendering ground. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched from a distance. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, was still months away, but discussions and preparations were underway. Britain's industrial heart depended on fuel, food, and raw materials arriving from the Americas, often through U-boat patrol waters. The war was increasingly about control over supply lines. Water, fuel, and food became weapons of survival as much as tanks or artillery. In the Eastern Mediterranean, naval engagements underscored this reality. The Royal Navy sought to secure shipping routes against Italian submarines and surface raiders. Convoys were meticulously planned. Timing, routes, and protection all mattered. Even minor miscalculations could result in disaster. One torpedo, one broken engine, one delay in water resupply could leave an entire battalion stranded and vulnerable to enemy action. The desert campaigns were as much a war of planning and endurance as of open confrontation. Back on land, soldiers endured the harshest conditions imaginable. Temperatures during the day soared past 40 degrees Celsius, while nights plummeted below freezing. Sandstorms could appear without warning, blotting out the sun, halting movement, and filling engines with abrasive grit. Men carried their lives in water canisters and ration tins. Without either, they became as vulnerable as the tanks and trucks they relied upon. Engineers improvised, soldiers adapted, and commanders calculated every ration. In many ways, these campaigns were quiet victories of logistics, often unnoticed in histories dominated by the roar of artillery. The Axis forces, too, faced similar challenges. Rommel understood the desert's brutal arithmetic. Rapid advances required secure supply lines. Fuel trucks and water convoys became primary targets for both sides. German and Italian forces experimented with mobile water storage, drilling deep wells and capturing Allied supply depots. Yet every success demanded precision, calculation, and risk. A missed ration could halt an entire advance, leaving armored columns stranded miles from support, exposed to counterattack. By early 1941, the stage was set. The Allies were not merely fighting the Axis, they were fighting the desert itself. Every decision about movement, attack, or defense had to account for geography, climate, and the finite resources that made modern warfare possible. Water, humble and ordinary, had become the quiet yet decisive factor that would shape campaigns, influence leadership decisions, and ultimately determine whether victory was possible. The world beyond the desert seemed distant, yet intimately connected. Convoys braved the Mediterranean. Industrial centers produced war material, and every ration counted. In 1941, survival in the desert was an intricate dance of supply, human endurance, and tactical ingenuity. And hidden within this struggle was a secret, the element that would quietly turn the tide for the Allies. By January 1941, Allied planners understood that the desert would not yield to force alone. Every soldier, every vehicle, and every artillery piece relied on a fragile chain of supplies stretching hundreds of kilometers across sand, rock, and scorching sun. Water was central to this chain, more precious than ammunition, more vital than fuel in many ways. Without it, engines overheated, men collapsed, and entire units risked annihilation. In Egypt and Libya, engineers devised ingenious methods to stretch limited reserves. Water was transported in reinforced tanks atop trucks, rationed in exact liters per man and animal. Every convoy carried more than weapons. It carried the lifeblood of the army. Even temporary depots along the desert route became strategic nodes, fiercely defended against raids. Intelligence reports emphasized that supply lines were just as critical as the front line itself. The Mediterranean became a highway of necessity and danger. Convoys from Alexandria and the Suez Canal navigated minefields, submarines, and unpredictable weather. The Royal Navy calculated timing with military precision. A delay could mean men marching hundreds of kilometers without adequate hydration. In one instance, reconnaissance of coastal wells revealed barely drinkable water, forcing commanders to ration even further. The desert demanded adaptation, ingenuity, and discipline. Meanwhile, industrial and scientific ingenuity played a role behind the scenes. Water purification units, initially designed for colonial expeditions, were repurposed for the desert campaigns. Engineers developed portable desalination and filtration systems, allowing troops to make use of brackish wells. Storage containers evolved. Steel tanks, collapsible bladders, and specially designed jerrycans became standard. Each innovation was a small victory, silently tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. On land, troops faced an unforgiving environment. Men marched under relentless sun, their progress measured not only in kilometers but in liters consumed. Camels and mules carried heavy loads where trucks could not pass, and artillery crews learned to prioritize supply over mobility. Desert warfare was a war of survival as much as strategy, where knowledge of terrain, weather, and scarce resources could outweigh numerical superiority. The Axis recognized the same reality. Rommel's advance depended on capturing supply depots intact. German intelligence focused on mapping Allied water sources, while Italian engineers experimented with mobile water storage systems. Yet their forces were stretched across vast distances, and any disruption could slow an advance by days, or leave armored columns stranded in the sun. Every decision, whether to press forward, wait for a convoy, or seize a well, carried immense consequences. Beyond the desert, the broader Allied strategy hinged on these logistics. The British High Command knew that a failure to sustain the front line could have cascading effects. North Africa was not isolated. It was tied to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and global supply networks. Oil from Persia, fuel from the United States, and material from factories in Britain had to converge with desert operations. Each element was a link in a chain, and water, the simplest of resources, was the most critical link of all. The human cost was evident. Diaries and letters describe men marching for hours, collapsing in the sand, reaching for rations that were often lighter than they should have been. Officers tracked every drop, every ration, with obsessive precision. It was not heroism alone that would carry the day. It was endurance, planning, and the ability to turn scarcity into a tactical advantage. By mid-January 1941, the Allies were on the precipice. Troop movements were coordinated with water convoys. Artillery and tanks moved only as the supply lines allowed. Engineers reinforced wells, naval convoys guarded shipments, and commanders calculated risk with a mathematician's precision. Every action, every order, reflected the recognition that the desert's hidden enemy, scarcity, was as deadly as any German or Italian soldier. This careful orchestration of resources would soon reveal its full impact. What seemed mundane, water, fuel, logistical planning would emerge as the decisive factor in the coming months. The seemingly ordinary could, in the hands of the disciplined and the innovative, become extraordinary. Victory in North Africa and in parts of the Mediterranean was not guaranteed by firepower alone. It would come from mastery over environment, ingenuity, and the meticulous control of life-sustaining resources. And as Allied forces prepared to meet the Axis in the desert, every eye turned toward the horizon, every hand measured a ration, every commander calculated the odds. The stage was set. The hidden secret of survival and of triumph was about to shape history. The desert demanded more than discipline. It demanded endurance. Soldiers faced an environment as lethal as any enemy. Sunburn seared exposed skin during the day. Sandstorms reduced visibility to a few meters, and nights brought temperatures below freezing. Water rationing became a daily calculus. 1 liter per man could determine life or death. Diaries from 8th Army soldiers described the constant thirst, the exhaustion from marching miles under the relentless sun, and the tension of awaiting resupply convoys that could be delayed by dust, mechanical failures, or enemy action. Men carried not only rifles and personal gear, but also the burden of survival, tracking every drop of water, calculating consumption for both themselves and the animals that pulled artillery and supplies. Camels and mules, indispensable in regions trucks could not traverse, relied on the same scarce reserves. Officers learned to balance the human toll with operational objectives, knowing that overextending troops without adequate hydration risk collapse. In many ways, the victory of 1941 was the victory of stamina, of human endurance honed under the most punishing conditions. The psychological impact of scarcity was equally profound. Soldiers faced constant awareness of mortality, not from bullets alone, but from the unforgiving desert. Letters home often mention thirst before fear, rationing before retreat. The human spirit was tested in every step across the dunes, where survival depended on obedience to plans, trust in leadership, and sheer resilience. Tactics in the desert were inseparable from logistics. Armies could maneuver hundreds of kilometers, but only if supply lines kept pace. Commanders had to plan routes according to available water sources, avoid terrain that would drain vehicles and men, and calculate timing with military precision. Ambushes were not only against enemy forces, but against the environment itself. A misstep could leave an armored column immobilized, exposed to air attacks, or isolated from reinforcements. Convoys became tactical units in their own right. Trucks carrying water, fuel, and ammunition required protection from enemy reconnaissance and artillery. The British learned to stagger movements, use camouflage, and coordinate with infantry and armored units to minimize exposure. Each tactical decision considered not just engagement with Axis forces, but also preservation of life-sustaining supplies. The ability to outmaneuver Rommel in this context often depended more on anticipating supply disruptions than predicting enemy true positions. Control over key wells, oases, and depots was central to strategy. Fortified positions were chosen not merely for defensive advantage, but for access to water. In this theater, the desert itself dictated tactics. The command that managed water resources effectively could project force further and sustain operations longer than numerically superior but poorly supplied enemies. Technology played a silent, indispensable role in converting scarcity into advantage. portable water purification units, improvised from colonial designs, allowed troops to utilize brackish or contaminated sources that otherwise would have been useless. Engineers experimented with filtration systems, distillation units, and storage innovations, ranging from collapsible bladders to reinforced steel tanks mounted on trucks. These innovations allowed the Allies to extend supply lines deeper into enemy territory. Mechanized units required water not only for men, but for engines. Desert heat threatened to overheat tanks, trucks, and artillery. Cooling systems were engineered to work under extreme conditions, while water-carrying vehicles became technological lifelines. Maintenance crews learned to improvise repairs in the field, often using the same limited resources meant for survival. Every innovation had a direct effect on operational capability, transforming ordinary materials into extraordinary force multipliers. Communication technologies also shaped resource management. Radio networks allowed headquarters to track convoy movements, anticipate shortages, and redirect supplies before crises emerged. Even minor improvements in mapping and reconnaissance, accurate measurements of wells, oasis locations, and terrain obstacles enhanced operational efficiency. Technological solutions were not glamorous. They were mundane, precise, and relentlessly practical. Yet these small innovations often determined whether a battalion could advance or whether it would be stranded, dehydrated, and vulnerable. In these three perspectives, human, tactical, and technological, the pattern becomes clear. Water was the hidden currency of survival. Victory in 1941 did not arise solely from firepower or numbers, but from an intricate, intertwined system of human endurance, operational planning, and practical innovation. The desert demanded mastery of all three, and the Allies' ability to integrate them quietly tipped the balance in their favor. As soldiers marched, convoys advanced, and engineers innovated, the desert war unfolded as a complex choreography. Every human action, tactical decision, and technological adaptation was measured against one constant: the scarcity of water. The coming months would reveal how this overlooked resource could determine battles, reshape campaigns, and alter the course of history. Command in the desert was a relentless test of foresight and precision. Generals and field officers balanced strategy against the unforgiving arithmetic of supply. Archibald Wavell, commanding the British Middle East forces, understood that desert warfare required more than aggressive tactics. It demanded meticulous resource management. Orders were dictated not just by the location of enemy formations, but by the capacity of supply lines to deliver water, fuel, and rations to the front. Rommel, the commander of the Africa Corps, faced similar pressures. His rapid advances depended on fuel trucks and water convoys keeping pace with mechanized columns. In diaries and operational reports, German officers noted that even brief disruptions in supply could halt momentum entirely. The famous Desert Fox reputation was built as much on operational audacity as on precise planning and ruthless attention to logistics. Every decision, whether to push forward, consolidate, or retreat, was measured against the stark reality of scarcity. Leadership extended to delegation and coordination. Field commanders managed convoys, engineers, and medical units, ensuring that scarce resources were distributed to maintain fighting capability. Mismanagement was deadly. A miscalculated ration or a misdirected convoy could leave hundreds of men incapacitated under the sun. Leadership in this context was not merely about strategy. It was about life itself, a careful orchestration of human and material resources under relentless pressure. The Axis forces, especially the Afrika Korps, understood the desert as both battlefield and adversary. Rommel's reports reveal constant concern over supply disruptions. The capture of a well, a depot, or even a single truck could dramatically alter the operational balance. German and Italian troops faced the same thirst, the same engine failures, and the same relentless sun as their opponents. Yet their approach often relied on rapid mobility and aggressive strikes, making them vulnerable when supply chains lagged. Reconnaissance became central to Axis strategy. Every Allied water source was mapped, every convoy monitored. Sabotage operations targeted supply lines, recognizing that the collapse of logistical support could achieve results no artillery barrage could. The desert was not neutral. It was a co-actor, amplifying the consequences of errors and rewarding meticulous planning. For the Axis, the battle for survival and supremacy was as much about controlling water and fuel as it was about engaging the enemy. At the human level, Axis soldiers endured the same privations as the Allies. Letters from the front described soldiers collapsing from heat exhaustion, rationing water as carefully as their opponents, and improvising survival strategies. The desert was impartial. No nationality or rank shielded a man from its harsh laws. Every engagement reflected not only tactical brilliance or error, but the intimate struggle between human endurance and environmental extremity. The extreme conditions of the Desert War raised profound moral questions. Commanders on both sides had to weigh aggressive tactics against the risk of exposing troops to lethal shortages. Decisions about rationing, forced marches, and engagement timing were not abstract calculations. They were life-or-death moral choices. Orders to advance might win ground, but they could also lead to dehydration, exhaustion, or death if supplies did not keep pace. Medical officers faced harrowing dilemmas. Soldiers suffering from heat stroke or dehydration could not always be rescued without risking convoys or exposing positions. Every ration, every drop of water became a moral instrument. Allocating it fairly while maintaining combat effectiveness demanded judgment, empathy, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism. These decisions reflected the human cost of warfare, emphasizing that victory often depended on ethical choices made under extreme pressure. Morality intersected with necessity in unexpected ways. Engineers and logisticians often improvised, repurposing water, fuel, or supplies in ways that maximized survival while minimizing waste. Leaders calculated risks not just to achieve tactical objectives, but to preserve the lives of men in conditions where the desert itself was a lethal opponent. This constant tension between human life, operational success, and environmental realities defined the moral landscape of the 1941 campaigns. Across all perspectives, a pattern emerges. The Desert War of 1941 was shaped by scarcity, ingenuity, and human resilience. Soldiers endured unimaginable hardship, relying on water as both lifeline and tactical asset. Commanders orchestrated operations with ruthless precision, balancing strategy with a moral responsibility of preserving life. Technology transformed scarcity into an operational advantage, enabling armies to extend supply lines and sustain momentum. And the enemy, equally constrained by the environment, had to navigate the same logistical challenges, making the struggle as much against nature as against each other. Water, ordinary yet essential, emerges as the invisible protagonist. It dictated human endurance, tactical possibility, and technological innovation. It guided leadership decisions, shaped enemy strategy, and defined moral boundaries. By integrating human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral perspectives, the full significance of this overlooked resource becomes clear. The campaigns of early 1941 were victories not only of skill and courage, but of foresight, planning, and survival under conditions that rewarded precision, discipline, and ingenuity. As the Allies and Axis prepared for decisive encounters, the interplay of these angles would determine who would gain the upper hand. Every decision, every movement, and every ration carried consequences. The stage was set for the turning point, where the strategic, human, and technological threads would converge into a climactic moment of triumph and trial. By March 1941, the North African desert had become a theater where survival depended as much on supply as on strategy. The British Eighth Army, stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, faced Rommel's Afrika Korps in a series of engagements that would test every resource, every plan, and every soldier. The impending confrontation at Bardia and Tobruk highlighted the critical importance of water, not as a background detail, but as a decisive element in operational success. Convoys leaving Alexandria carried tons of water, fuel, and rations, guarded by armored units and naval escorts. Each journey was fraught with risk. Sandstorms could delay arrival by hours. Mines could cripple trucks, and Axis aircraft prowled the skies, targeting the very lifelines upon which the front depended. For the soldiers marching across the desert, the arrival of water determined whether they could advance, hold position, or survive the day. On March 2nd, the British prepared to assault the Italian-held fortress of Bardia. General Wavel's plan hinged on synchronized advances of infantry and artillery. Yet the effectiveness of the operation depended on the availability of water for both men and machinery. Engineers had established temporary depots along the route, but delays in convoy arrival threatened to stall the assault. Officers tracked every leader, every ration, coordinating movements with meticulous precision. One miscalculation could leave troops stranded under relentless sun, vulnerable to counterattack. As the attack commenced, tanks rolled across the dunes, their engines humming, soldiers advancing in staggered formations to conserve energy and maintain hydration. Water carriers moved ahead of the main column, distributing rations to those most in need. The desert's harsh environment amplified every tactical decision. A misstep could result in overheating engines, exhausted men, and a failed assault. Yet the plan held. The combination of foresight, precise execution, and resource management allowed the British to breach Italian defenses with minimal losses relative to the scale of the operation. Meanwhile, Rommel's forces faced similar pressures. Intelligence reports had indicated the Allied reliance on water convoys, and Axis planners sought to disrupt these lifelines. Sabotage operations targeted depots and convoys, aiming to stall the British advance. Yet the Allies' redundancy in planning, extra depots, alternative routes, and water purification units mitigated the impact of these attacks. The ability to sustain movement despite enemy interference became a decisive factor, tipping the scales in favor of the Eighth Army. The capture of Tobruk later in June 1941 further demonstrated the interplay of logistics and tactical success. Allied forces relied on careful water management to maintain pressure on Italian defenses. Engineers repaired wells, convoys ensured a steady supply, and troops were able to advance with sustained energy. Tobruk's fall was not merely the result of superior firepower. It was the culmination of months of planning, adaptation, and survival under conditions where water dictated the pace and possibility of victory. At the human level, soldiers recount the relentless nature of the campaign. Marches of 20 to 30 kilometers were standard, often under temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. Exhaustion and dehydration threatened morale and operational effectiveness. Yet the discipline instilled by leadership, combined with the ingenuity of engineers and support units, allowed men to maintain combat readiness. Every rationed leader, every calculated stop, and every improvised solution contributed to the outcome. Victory was measured not only in captured territory, but in lives preserved and objectives achieved under extreme conditions. Technological adaptations amplified this advantage. Portable water filtration systems, reinforced storage containers, and mobile distribution networks allowed forces to operate deeper in the desert than would otherwise have been possible. Tank crews relied on water to maintain engine cooling systems, and artillery units depended on it to sustain mobility. Even minor innovations, such as collapsible bladders that could be filled from natural sources, provided critical flexibility, enabling operations that might have been impossible just weeks earlier. By mid-1941, the interplay of human endurance, tactical foresight, and technological adaptation reached a crescendo. Convoys delivered essential supplies across vast, hostile terrain, engineers repaired wells under fire, and soldiers advanced with a rhythm dictated as much by hydration as by enemy movements. Each element, the men, the machines, and the water that sustained them, converged to create a decisive advantage that would carry through subsequent engagements in the theater. The desert had revealed its harshest truth. Survival, planning, and innovation were inseparable from tactical success. For the Allies, the ability to integrate these elements, anticipating shortages, adapting to the environment, and preserving life became the invisible factor behind victories in Bardia, Tobruk, and beyond. The campaigns of early 1941 were not solely battles of bullets and artillery. They were battles of foresight, endurance, and mastery over scarcity. As the dust settled over the dunes, the Axis recognized the growing challenge. Rommel's momentum slowed, constrained by the same environmental realities that tested his opponents. The desert was no longer a passive stage. It was a force shaping decisions, influencing outcomes, and revealing the decisive power of the Allied logistical advantage. The next phase of this climax would show how these converging factors, human resilience, tactical planning, and the hidden power of water, culminated in engagements that decisively shifted the campaign. The turning point was at hand, and history would soon record the impact of these often overlooked elements. By late June 1941, the momentum of the North African campaign had shifted. Tobruk, long a thorn in the Allies' side, had fallen after weeks of meticulously coordinated operations. For the first time, the desert's harsh arithmetic had been harnessed with precision. Every convoy, every water ration, and every improvised innovation had combined to create a decisive edge. Soldiers and engineers alike understood that their success was not born solely from firepower or numbers, but from mastery over survival itself. The capture of Tobruk marked a turning point not only in geography, but in morale. Allied troops celebrated, yet the victory was measured in more than flags or territory. Engineers continued to repair wells, trucks ferried water to the front lines, and supply officers recalculated rations to sustain further advances. The desert had not been conquered. It had been negotiated through planning, endurance, and the careful orchestration of limited resources. Rommel, recognizing the challenge, adjusted his strategy. The Africa Corps launched counterattacks designed to disrupt supply lines, targeting convoys, depots, and wells. In mid-July, a well-aimed Italian artillery strike disabled a key water depot near Derna. For hours, Allied units faced the real threat of dehydration. Yet redundancy in planning, combined with portable water purification units and alternate supply routes, mitigated the impact. The ability to maintain operational tempo under such conditions underscored the centrality of logistics in desert warfare. Tactical brilliance, human endurance, and technological adaptation converged during these engagements. Infantry units advanced in staggered formations to conserve energy. Tank crews monitored cooling systems closely, and engineers maintained makeshift pipelines to extend water availability. Every operation, from skirmishes to full-scale assaults, was shaped by the management of life-sustaining resources. The war in North Africa was no longer solely a contest of arms. It had become a contest of survival and ingenuity. The human element remained paramount. Soldiers faced relentless heat and exhaustion, marching for hours on end while rationing water to maintain combat readiness. Diaries and field reports describe men enduring days without direct contact with supply convoys, relying on careful planning and discipline to survive. Morale depended as much on confidence in leadership and trust in logistical systems as on the hope of victory. Commanders calculated movements with acute awareness that one misjudgment, one misallocated liter of water, could result in collapse and defeat. By August 1941, the Allies' operational advantage became unmistakable. The capture of strategic coastal towns, secure supply depots, and key wells allowed forces to project power further into Libyan territory. Convoys from Alexandria and the Suez Canal continued to deliver water, fuel, and rations, ensuring that mechanized units could advance without pausing for survival. Technological innovations, from collapsible water bladders to mobile filtration units, provided flexibility that Rommel's forces struggled to match. Axis forces responded with aggression, yet every advance was constrained by environmental realities. Long supply lines extended across hundreds of kilometers of desert, left columns vulnerable. Even when they achieved local tactical success, shortages of water and fuel limited their ability to consolidate gains. Rommel's reports repeatedly noted that the desert imposed its own rhythm. No maneuver could succeed without accounting for human endurance and resource availability. The decisive engagements of 1941 illustrate the interplay of foresight, endurance, and innovation. Bardia, Tobruk, and surrounding operations reveal that the desert was not merely a backdrop for combat. It was an active participant, shaping decisions, amplifying successes, and punishing errors. Victory required synchronization. Human effort, tactical skill, and technological support had to converge precisely. Water, ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in consequence, was at the center of every successful operation. As summer gave way to autumn, the cumulative effect became clear. Allied forces, having mastered the desert's logistical challenges, now held a persistent advantage over Axis opponents. Strategic points were secured, supply lines were reliable, and troops operated with confidence in their ability to survive and advance. The turning point had been reached. The Desert War, once a contest of uncertainty and attrition, had become a campaign shaped by planning, endurance, and the quiet power of resource management. The desert's lesson was stark and enduring. Armies could not rely solely on superior firepower or daring maneuvers. They had to master the environment, anticipate scarcity, and innovate under pressure. The Allies' victories of 1941 were as much a triumph of preparation, foresight, and human resilience as of combat prowess. Every successful engagement, every captured position, and every preserved life was a testament to the meticulous orchestration of survival in one of the harshest theaters of war. The stage was set for the aftermath. The consequences of these victories would ripple across the Mediterranean and beyond, reshaping strategy, morale, and the broader course of the war. The hidden, often overlooked factor, water, the lifeblood of desert campaigns, had quietly turned into gold, determining outcomes far beyond the battlefield. The dust had barely settled over Tobruk and Bardia before the impact of Allied victories became clear. Territory captured, supply lines secured, and strategic coastal towns controlled, the Eighth Army had gained more than a few kilometers of desert. It had gained breathing room. The meticulous orchestration of water and resources had allowed forces to advance without pause, maintaining momentum where miscalculations could have led to disaster. Reports from the field emphasized a recurring theme. Survival, not just combat, had determined success. Casualty figures, while significant, were mitigated by careful planning. The British Eighth Army sustained losses estimated at several thousand men, yet many more potential casualties were avoided thanks to the foresight of logistical officers. Units that might have collapsed under heat and dehydration remained operational. Engineers and supply crews, often overlooked in official reports, receive recognition for maintaining water depots, improvising filtration systems, and ensuring a continuous flow of rations. Their work was the invisible backbone of the victories, quietly decisive. Axis forces faced their own stark reckoning. Rommel's rapid advances, initially successful, slowed dramatically under the combined pressures of extended supply lines and environmental scarcity. Local tactical gains could not be consolidated because fuel and water could not reach forward units in time. Italian units, poorly coordinated and overextended, found themselves vulnerable. The desert had exacted a cost that bullets alone could not. Attrition through environment and logistical limitations. German and Italian war diaries repeatedly note the frustration of high command, acknowledging that the Allies' mastery over supply had neutralized the advantage of aggressive maneuvers. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the victories had broader strategic implications. The Mediterranean theater, previously contested with uncertainty, now tilted toward the Allies. Control over Tobruk provided a critical port for further supply operations, enabling larger convoys to support deep desert campaigns. Water, fuel, and rations could reach the front lines more reliably, granting commanders flexibility in planning future offensives. The campaign demonstrated that control over resources, not just territory or weaponry, could determine operational freedom. Morale surged among Allied troops. Letters home describe renewed confidence, not only in their leaders, but in their ability to endure the desert's harsh conditions. Soldiers trusted the reliability of supply, knowing that engineers and convoy operators had anticipated shortages and devised contingencies. The psychological effect was profound. Men willing to advance miles under scorching sun, tanks moving without overheating, and artillery units remaining mobile, all because the invisible lifeline of water had been secured. Victory in the desert was no longer a matter of hope. It was a calculated probability. Historical reports corroborate the scale of this achievement. British Army dispatches highlighted that nearly 80% of scheduled convoys during the first half of 1941 arrived on time, carrying crucial water and fuel. Italian and German intelligence noted the surprising efficiency of Allied supply operations, with repeated mention of the innovative use of water bladders, purification units, and mobile storage. Scholars later emphasized that these logistical feats, often overshadowed by the drama of combat, were instrumental in shaping the outcome of the North African campaign. Even the environment itself began to favor the Allies. By securing water sources and establishing fortified depots, they could operate deeper into Libyan territory than the Axis forces, whose extended supply lines were increasingly vulnerable. The desert, once a neutral yet deadly backdrop, now became a strategic ally, exploited through foresight, engineering, and careful planning. Every liter of water, ration, and fuel contributed to operational dominance, reinforcing the lesson that survival and success were inseparable. The immediate aftermath of these victories set the tone for the remainder of 1941. Allied forces could consolidate positions, fortify supply chains, and plan further operations with confidence. Axis forces, constrained by environmental and logistical limitations, were forced onto the defensive in several sectors. The campaigns revealed a critical truth. In the harsh expanse of North Africa, resources were as decisive as rifles, and the careful management of water had quietly reshaped the course of conflict. The victories of early 1941 reshaped the strategic landscape of North Africa. Allied control over key ports, depots, and water sources allowed forces to sustain longer campaigns, project power deeper into Libyan territory, and coordinate offensives with unprecedented efficiency. Tobruk, once a symbol of Italian strength, became a linchpin of supply and morale, providing a secure harbor for convoys delivering water, fuel, and material from Alexandria and beyond. The successful management of these resources transformed the desert from an obstacle into a strategic asset. The Axis, meanwhile, faced an increasingly precarious situation. Rommel's earlier momentum had been slowed not by lack of skill or daring, but by environmental constraints and logistical shortfalls. Extended supply lines, vulnerable convoys, and overtaxed troops limited operational freedom. Even local successes could not compensate for the cumulative effect of scarcity. German and Italian commanders repeatedly noted in war diaries that the Allies' foresight in securing water and sustaining forces allowed them to dictate the pace of operations. By controlling the essentials of survival, the Allies had effectively neutralized many of Rommel's advantages. Strategically, these victories enabled a broader Allied focus. Resources previously tied to mere survival, water, fuel, rations, could now support offensive operations. Armored divisions advanced with confidence. Artillery units maintained mobility, and infantry could endure longer marches under extreme conditions. The desert became a stage not only for battles, but for demonstrations of ingenuity. Mobile water purification units, reinforced supply depots, and careful convoy scheduling became integral to campaign planning. The war was no longer fought solely with weapons. It was fought with foresight, logistics, and human endurance. Industrial and logistical infrastructures also benefited. Ports like Alexandria and Tobruk became critical hubs, integrating maritime supply with desert operations. Engineers and planners refined methods of water storage, filtration, and distribution, creating systems that could be scaled for subsequent campaigns. This combination of technology and planning provided lessons that would inform operations across the Mediterranean, including future offensives in Libya, Egypt, and beyond. The desert campaigns of 1941 demonstrated that mastery over resources could be as decisive as mastery over terrain or enemy forces. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Allied soldiers gained confidence not only in their leaders, but in their ability to endure the desert's harshness. Trust in the reliability of supply and logistical ingenuity allowed troops to focus on objectives rather than survival. Morale became a force multiplier, enhancing operational effectiveness and cohesion across units. Conversely, Axis forces experienced frustration and attrition, with extended supply lines, exhausted troops, and logistical failures undermining tactical successes. The desert's harsh laws have become a form of asymmetric advantage, exploited expertly by the Allies. The campaign's lessons resonated beyond North Africa. Allied planners recognized that control over essentials, water, fuel, rations, was inseparable from combat strategy. Subsequent operations in the Mediterranean and Middle East would continue to reflect this principle, as engineers, logisticians, and commanders coordinated to turn scarcity into strategic advantage. The hidden hero of these campaigns was not a general or tank division, but a resource so ordinary yet so critical: water. Its careful management had transformed survival into victory, shaping the course of the war in a theater where environment and logistics dictated outcomes as decisively as bullets or bombs. By the end of 1941, the North African front had shifted irreversibly in favor of the Allies. The mastery of desert conditions, the successful orchestration of supply lines, and the innovative use of technology had combined to deliver victories that were as much about endurance and planning as about combat. The lessons of this period would influence strategy for the remainder of the war. Resources could not be taken for granted, and their management could determine the fate of armies and the outcome of campaigns. As the dust of these victories settled, it became evident that the secret of Allied success in 1941 was neither glamorous nor dramatic in the conventional sense. It was hidden in the careful calculation of rations, the foresight of engineers, and the disciplined endurance of soldiers who marched across an unforgiving desert with life itself hanging on every drop of water. From this understanding, the reflection emerges that true victory often relies on the unseen, the overlooked, and the ordinary elevated into extraordinary consequence. The campaigns of 1941 in North Africa remind us that victory is rarely forged by weapons alone. It is measured by endurance, foresight, and the ability to navigate scarcity. In the barren deserts stretching from Egypt to Libya, water, a resource so ordinary it is often overlooked, became a decisive factor, quietly determining life and death, success and failure. Soldiers marched, engines ran, and artillery moved not simply because of courage or firepower, but because the unseen arteries of supply had been meticulously maintained. This truth reshaped strategy, morale, and the broader course of the war. Allied forces learned to respect the environment, to anticipate its challenges, and to integrate technological innovation with human discipline. Portable water filtration units, collapsible tanks, and improvised depots were not glamorous instruments of war, but they transformed the impossible into the achievable. Commanders, engineers, and soldiers alike understood that mastery over resources was inseparable from mastery over the battlefield. For the Axis, the desert imposed its impartial justice. Even the most audacious maneuvers could falter without logistical support. Rommel's Afrika Korps, despite brilliance and aggression, was constrained by the same elemental forces that tested the Allies. The war in the desert was not simply a clash of armies. It was a contest between human ingenuity and an environment indifferent to ambition. Yet there is a deeper lesson beyond strategy and survival. The story of 1941 demonstrates how ordinary elements, water, planning, discipline, can become extraordinary when leveraged with intelligence and care. It reveals the quiet heroism of engineers, logisticians, and soldiers enduring privation to sustain life and achieve victory. In this sense, the desert campaigns were as much a testament to human resilience and ingenuity as they were to military skill. History often remembers battles for their generals and tanks, for the moments of valor and destruction. But in North Africa, the secret of victory lay in a meticulous, often invisible orchestration of survival. Water turned into gold, not through alchemy, but through strategy, endurance, and foresight. And it is in understanding this, in appreciating the unseen forces that shape outcomes, that we grasp the true weight of human effort and the enduring lessons of war.